Welcome to Brainfluence. I'm Roger Dooley. Life is full of choices. There are the choices we make and the choices we try to influence other people, like employees or customers, to make. Today's guest is going to unlock at least a few of the secrets of how people decide and how their decisions can be influenced. Eric J. Johnson is a professor and the director of the Center for Decision Science at Columbia Business School. He's been the president of both the Society for Judgment and Decision Making and the Society for Neuroeconomics. His new book is titled The Elements of Choice: Why the Way We Decide Matters. Welcome to the show, Eric.
Thank you. Glad to join you and glad to join your listeners.
Yeah, Eric, I think that probably many of our audience members are familiar with the concept of choice architecture, but can you sort of briefly define that topic?
Absolutely. I mean, whenever we make a choice, we have a hidden partner, and we don't realize it, but somebody's made a group of decisions that could influence us. So, for example, if you're picking a retirement plan on a website, somebody's decided lots of things about how to present that to you. They've decided how many options to present to you, what attributes to describe, how to describe those attributes. So I give you annual returns, 10-year returns. How do I describe that? And that person, who I could call a choice architect, but I'm going to call a designer to make things a little bit simpler, that designer has actually influenced you whether you know it or not.
Right. And of course, sometimes those designers are intentional about their choices, and other times they just happen. Somebody hands a form to an intern and says, here, people have to fill out this form. Can you just clean it up a little bit and publish it on the website?
Right. No, you're absolutely right. A lot of designers are doing things haphazardly, and they don't think what they're going to do is going to make a difference. So one of the lessons research teaches us is that choice architects or designers don't realize the power they have. It's almost as if they have a sort of secret power they don't know about. The second thing that's important about choice architecture is we're all designers. We all present choices to other people. So, we think about a website, but we're also presenting, to our spouses, where do we want to go to dinner tonight? To our kids, what clothes do you want to wear to school today? We are actually designers probably almost as often as we are choosers, the people who are making choices.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great point, Eric, because most of us, unless we happen to be a graphic designer, would not undertake to design, say, a poster for a theater production or something. You say, well, no, we need somebody who knows a little bit about how to do that. But we wouldn't give a second thought to designing a form, for example, even something that's really a high-stakes form, like a retirement plan enrollment form or some other type of thing like that we just assume, well, people are going to decide on a rational basis, and the presentation doesn't count. But you spend pretty much the whole book showing that the presentation does count. I wanted to read the opening sentence here from your book, which I've got an advanced copy here, and it's it's a fascinating book. The opening sentence is, it's an illusion, really, that we alone determine what we choose. And I think that's the point that you're making, that, people think that when they make decisions, they are simply processing the information, much like a computer might, and making a decision. And of course, we know that's not true, but the presentation really counts. So explain the concept of plausible paths. That's something that I think probably is less familiar to our audience members, and how that's a theme that recurs throughout the book.
So it's actually an important thing, and trying to think about how you put years of research into things that people can find useful and have some principles to explain it. One of the obvious things is we don't look at all the information. When you're in a supermarket, you go down the aisle, only look at some of the things. You're obviously not looking at every option. If you're on a website, you're going to look at some small part of that. The small part you look at is what's called a plausible path. So we could spend all day making decisions. We typically pick a subset of that information. And so let me give one example, which I like, which is if on dating services, online dating, which is actually a choice architecture. We don't like to think about our choices of spouses, potential future spouses, being a function of some designer's decisions. But let me give you one example. I give you a dating service. When they started out, Coffee Meets Bagel wanted to essentially be different than the rest of the dating sites. They showed you one potential date a day. Compare that to, let's say, something like Tinder, where the number of your thumb essentially determines how many options you're going to see. Now, are you going to choose to look at the same information in those two cases? Well, we know that as soon as you see lots of options, the first thing you do is you screen. You're taking an attribute that's easy to comprehend and just eliminate people who don't meet that. And so there's even a phrase that I love, which is called Tinder thumb, which is basically getting tired from looking at so many potential dates. And what starts out feeling like a game, this is from the Urban Dictionary, ends up feeling like a dismal experience. Now, in Coffee Meets Bagel, you can look at that person and you go beyond appearance. You look at their hobbies, their interests, other things. So you could end up looking very differently. The plausible paths are very different in the two cases. And, in one case, you're putting a lot of weight on appearance. In the other case, you might be looking at other characteristics of the person. So plausible paths often determine how we choose.
Mm-hmm. Well, but when you say plausible path, I guess you've used it in a variety of ways, even layouts in physical spaces, for example. What makes a path plausible?
I think people are really influenced, particularly at the beginning of the decision, of what feels to be easy. So the reason pictures appeal, perhaps on Tinder, is because it's very easy to make a judgment about who is attractive and who's not attractive. There's another great piece of research that shows that men look at age to screen, and it turns out they don't write people who are even a year older than they are. Women, it's not they're immune from screening. There's a group of women in this research, which is great. They look for people who are at least 4 inches taller than they are so they can wear heels. So it's an easy way to make at least an initial broad path choice. So this ease notion, and you can change ease lots of different ways that have nothing to do with quality. You can actually use ugly fonts, and that makes that information harder to read. You can actually use fancy language, which makes it hard to read, even small type. So lots of things that have nothing to do with the quality of the options per se can determine which plausible path you use. And so that disconnect is one of the reasons choice architecture works.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so in that case, choosing the less fluent font or more cognitively difficult to process font would dissuade people from choosing that option versus another option. The other option would seem more plausible.
Right. And also, if you think about an attribute, think about presenting interest rates. You can present them to 7.9356. That's not very easy to read. If you present it as like 7.9, people might find that easier to look at that characteristic. Otherwise, they'll just ignore it, or at least tend to not look at it.
One area that has been a fascination of mine over the years is the whole college admissions process, college search process. And it's kind of the U.S. situation. What we have here in the United States is kind of unique compared to many other countries, because here in this country, we have probably 3,000 plus institutions of higher education. And theoretically, a student could go to any one of them. Now, many are not necessarily attractive to all students. The majority of students, they're intended mainly for people immediately in their area or for a very specialized topic or something. Some are very hard to get into, but still the choice is overwhelming. And, trying to simplify that process, trying to say, okay, what is a way of even finding that plausible path? Because it's kind of overwhelming to the typical traditional student, the high school late junior, early senior, who is doing that sort of equivalent of flipping through Tinder, flipping through college websites or descriptions or different sites that may present capsule views of schools, trying to figure out what looks best. And there's so many criteria to choose from. Do you have any thoughts on that process?
Sure. So obviously with so many options, people often screen. So they'll screen by things that seem, ultimately nonsensical, like how good is the school in a sport that I don't play, that maybe I will go to one game. But that, it turns out, by the way, at some schools, enrollments go up enormously when they appear in a football bowl game, for example. So that brings us to sort of the second concept that's really important, which is the role of memory, what I call assembled preferences. So if you think about it, why does that work? Well, it works partly because I heard the famous Flutie effect when Doug Flutie many years ago, did very well at it was Boston College, wasn't it?
Yes, Boston College.
He actually, admissions went way up. It's because everyone all of a sudden heard of a school they hadn't heard of called Boston College. So it became very accessible in memory. And then when they sat down and said, gee, what colleges I'm going to look at, even before I go to the website, or back then, the big paper books, that's something that will come up very quickly. And it's a good example of a choice where you were overwhelmed by the number of options. So you simplify by taking a plausible path, one of which is, what schools can I remember? And those would be schools your parents went to, schools that neighbors your kid went to, not necessarily the most important criteria for deciding where you're going to get the best education.
Mm-hmm. I know. And years ago, I co-founded a business called College Confidential. And along the way, ultimately, we were acquired by a much bigger company, and we developed a college search tool or college matching tool that took into account student preferences, everything from the size of the school, location, and so on. But we didn't make it a sieve type process where typically at that point, at least, the traditional college search program said, I will go to school in these states. And if you picked a state, right, you saw schools in that state. If you didn't pick that state, you didn't see anything from that state. So instead, we had a strength of preference, but also introduced some sort of fuzzy matching. Like if we found a really good match that did not meet one of the criteria or more to the criteria, we still showed the student that school. And that was kind of our solution. But even then fell short because you're so influenced by these choices that were set up initially. I mean, if a student says, I really want to go to a big school, do they know that for sure? Do they know that they wouldn't do fantastically well at a small liberal arts college someplace, even though they're looking at big state schools? And that's the real dilemma there. And there probably is no easy answer, but I guess the good part is there is research that shows that students tend to like where they end up. Despite all the agony that they go through in the selection process and then potentially getting rejected by their dream school, that when the students are surveyed after their first year, the vast majority are really pretty happy with where they're at.
Right. But what we don't know is how well they would have done if they had made a different choice. We never run as I kiddingly say, we never run the control Eric or the control Roger. We don't know what would have happened if we'd taken that other option. So it's hard to tell. Let me reinforce that point by talking about New York City schools, because New York City gives students going to high school a lot of choice. In fact, 769 when I last looked. And that's a lot of choices for a 14-year-old and parents to make. And so it's another case where people probably don't do very well. It turns out people who are who have educated parents do better. But there's a story that I love, which is this very young Jamaican kid who was his class's valedictorian, said, I want to go to a good school. And for me, a good school is one that has a high percentage of people that graduate. There's a sad fact about New York schools that there are some high schools that don't even graduate half of the kids that go to that school. I mean, I just find that amazing. And the idea was, he just said, I'm going to apply to the schools that will graduate. And it turns out, of course, it's 95, 99, 98% of the kids. And unfortunately, he did not get in because those also turn out to be the most competitive schools. Although he was quite good, he was not super top of 1/10 of 1% good. And so he ended up not matching with any of the schools. Literally, he ended up making a choice from the leftovers. And like you say, he ended up being very happy there and did well. But it's a very, very different experience going to, in this case, a good advanced tech school than it would have been if he'd gotten to a college prep school. I mean, he would have turned out to be a different person. Again, he chose the plausible path, understandably, saying, I just want one attribute, maximizing it, which is, who graduates kids? And he has another attribute he should have cared a lot more about, which is, and what's my probability of getting in? That's a hard thing to think about. That's much more complicated than he it's not in the book. So the attribute he cared about was impossible to figure out easily.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like maybe the strategy for New York City kids is to use the same strategy you're supposed to use for colleges, which is apply to schools that you have a pretty good shot at getting into. You're not certain, your ballpark schools, maybe have a reach in there, apply to that elite school, and then also have a safety that you think is going to be a good backup, rather than just every year, despite that advice being given by every college counselor on the planet, every knowledgeable parent on the planet, we always ended up seeing kids who got rejected from every school they applied to because they just, their counselor said, "Oh, you'll get into everywhere you apply. Don't worry about it. You've got great grades," not realizing the meat grinder of elite college admissions. Eric, another topic that I think is probably near and dear to our hearts in the U.S. these days is voting. There's been a lot of controversy about voting methods and such, and we've had contested elections. Talk a little bit about some of the choice architecture involved in the voting process.
There is some amazing stories, and perhaps when you think about choice architecture, some people who are been around for a while think about 2000, when George Bush beat Al Gore in Florida by, I think it was 690 votes, and that was one of the more consequential elections in the U.S. And everyone was concerned at the time with hanging chads, and you may recall that people were trying to figure out what was his first intent. It turns out there's another thing that happens, which is the person who's first on the ballot typically gets a 1% to 2% increase. Now, knowing that, by the way, is about as much as you get if you have a good turnout the vote operation. If you call everyone who's your potential voter and offer to drive in the poll, you'll get 1%. So being first on the ballot, not only in Florida, but in general, is important. There are a few states where you actually randomize the order. Ohio, for example, in each precinct puts a different candidate first. So you can actually estimate how important that is. And that's where that 1% to 2% number comes from. It turns out that the governor of Florida, no matter what their party is, decides who's going to be on the ballot. And of course, if it's a Republican, it's always the Republican candidate. In this case, George Bush's brother, Jeb, was the governor. And so he appeared on everything. You can care about hanging chads. It's a small effect. But if you had randomized the ballot, you might have had a very different outcome.
Mm-hmm. And of course, like most things in the election process, it's not unique to one party. They both try and exploit these advantages. But, these days, we do have the technology to randomize.
Absolutely. Can I give you an example where it's even worse? To be a full fairness critic. In Delaware, by law, it's always the Democrat. So if I were a Republican, I would be pretty upset by that rule.
That's strange, but I'm sure there's some interesting history behind that. But I mean, today with digital technology and electronic voting in many places, shouldn't be a big deal to randomize even individual ballots, not even at there's some kind of geographic divide, but it's also political because people are unwilling to give up any advantage, even if they're not sure they're going to have that advantage, even if that advantage is going to go to the other party in a year or two. There's always this feeling that, well, we can't give that potential up. And maybe someday, but I think in the meantime, we'll have this effort to influence the choice architecture by whoever is in power at the particular moment.
Absolutely. I'm an optimist, so I talk mostly about designers who are trying to help people make better decisions. But of course, that's not the world we live in. And there are lots of examples of people using choice architecture in their own best interest, sometimes at the cost of the chooser.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think if we look at businesses that are savvy about this, we see some positive things. Like typically, you are opted into people's mailing lists. Actually, I think a lot of times you're opted in without even getting a choice, from what I can tell. Right. I'm sure I never signed up for a lot of those businesses that are emailing me. I place one order with them and they decide that I immediately need an email every day to tell me about things I don't care about. But in general, even those businesses that do offer the choice use that opt-in strategy. In fact, you make a good point that the default strategy basically never fails, right? There are very few situations where if you can make one choice the default choice, where that will be a disadvantage for whatever that choice is.
So it's a very good point. And a firm that I work with sometimes sort of says, there in terms of sizes of effects, what really works, there's defaults and there's everything else. And I think that's a bit of an exaggeration, but defaults tend to be pretty reliable. In this day and age where people are questioning what research results replicate, defaults actually are pretty good that way. We did a paper where we looked at every possible default study we could find, including asking for people whose default studies failed. And we found that there was a very strong effect. Now, my most famous piece of research looked at organ donation, people's willingness to declare themselves a donor. And that had like a 40% difference. And so lots of people say, oh, all I have to do is change the one line of HTML and I'm going to make something the default and get that same boost. Well, life nor is behavioral science quite that simple. And there's lots of factors to determine that. The nice thing is on average, we found that there was somewhere between a 28 and 30% increase in share of the default option. Now, it varied a lot. Some studies, it was up to 90%. Others, it was not different from zero, but it never hurt, to your point. And so defaults are one of those things where A, they're pretty robust, but B, it helps a lot to know what causes the default effect and not just know defaults matter.
Well, when you say what causes the default effect, other than just inertia, is there another explanation?
Right. So I talk about 3 E's. Your inertia is what I call E's. It's just easy not to do anything, and I get the default. And there are studies that do that, and they get effects. There's a second thing, which is endorsement. So, which is actually, is the person who's making the default somebody I trust? And do they think this is in my best interest? So I imagine you would find very different results if it's a trusted source than an untrusted source. And so that's going to make a difference. The third thing is that defaults make you think you take the perspective as if you already own the option. That is, in organ donation, for example, we find that when you ask people, you're a donor, do you want to be? They first start thinking about the advantages of being a donor. Then they think a little bit about the disadvantages. If you do the reverse and ask people, you're not a donor, do you want to be? They start thinking about the disadvantages, and that tends to overwhelm the advantages. And so you actually get a big default effect because of endowment. You feel like you already own the option that's pre-checked. And when you get all 3 working, that's when you get a big default effect.
Mm-hmm. And I think from a business standpoint, probably most of the folks in our audience know that. But it's a good thing to emphasize again that if you're really trying to get your customers to do something and it's to their benefit, then make that the default. If it's not to their benefit, then you may want to give them a much more clear choice. But if it's going to help them, or your employees for that matter, if it's going to be good for them, and this is of course the story of retirement plans, and why now just about all 401k plans in the United States are automatically opted in, because that gets people to save more for retirement, which is considered to be a good thing for society as well as for them.
Absolutely. Now, it's actually a good example because it's a case where most people didn't save enough. So we wanted to encourage that. And in fact, most people would even tell you, I should save more than I actually am. So they would find this an okay thing. It gets more complicated when you get to other stages of your financial life. So for example, when you retire, when you turn 62, you get a choice whether or not to claim Social Security. Now, it turns out you get about 8% increase year over year by waiting. And I don't know, maybe with the exception of the current market, it's very hard to think of when you get an 8% riskless return on your money. That would be pretty good. And if you had other money invested, you probably should be living off of that so that you actually can watch your Social Security check grow in the future. So that would be the great thing. So you'd be tempted to actually maybe make claiming at 70, which is the oldest you can in the US, the default. But there's a problem. Not everybody would be better off. There are going to be people who are going to not live that long, or who can't get another job, or don't have more money. So by defaulting people into the later claiming age, you might be hurting some people and not helping others. So this actually shows that choice architecture, although you're right, defaults are an easy thing to understand. They're very powerful. Might not always be the best thing to do. I talk about smart defaults, where you actually know something about somebody. You might make the default customized to them. So you can imagine if somebody is not employed, doesn't have any savings, their default should maybe be claim now. For other people, their default should be claim at 70. And so you could actually customize defaults as you learn more about the customer or about the person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, so there's some fintech firms, maybe some big banks too, that are doing this. I went through a process. I didn't actually enroll in a plan with this firm, but I signed up as if I was going to look at what my portfolio should be. And they asked me a few questions, not a lot, but just to sort of assess my general financial situation, and they presented me with a default portfolio, basically a mix of 3 index funds of different styles or something. And, to me, that made a lot of sense because they had customized it for me in a way. They were presenting me with, this is what we recommend. I could presumably change that if I actually signed up and decided to invest. But it gave me that guidance and the default to give me something that would probably be pretty good for my needs. So that makes a lot of sense. Speaking of retirement plans, Eric, this sounds like the setup for a joke. 2 behavioral economists walk into a restaurant and talk to the waiter, and the waiter sort of schools them in menu design, or tries to school them in menu design. You and your colleague Richard Thaler went into a restaurant and got into a discussion of menu design. What do restaurateurs think works on restaurant menus, and what actually does?
So it was really interesting because he was very earnest and said, here's the book I studied when I went to the Culinary Institute to learn menu psychology. And so, he emailed me the next day. I ordered it immediately from Amazon and looked through and said, there's no science here. This is somebody's opinion. And they all had this view that people actually look at what they call the power zone. And I started reading the literature because I thought this would be the best example of an application of choice architecture in the book. It turns out that is essentially an area where nobody has done research. When they do research, they find out the expert's advice wasn't very good. There are techniques. For example, you can actually track somebody's eyes as they read a menu. And that shows that essentially what the experts thought wasn't right. Essentially, if you thought about a second, what you mostly do is you start with appetizers, you go to entrees, and you read it much more like a book instead of just going immediately to one thing. And so, our fantasy, which was this would be, the clearest case, I could say restaurant A used this technique and made a lot more money than restaurant B. Turned out nobody really knew what they were talking about. Now I think you're seeing a lot more in terms of experiments and A/B testing for menus. Particularly, by the way, when menus are electronic, it's very easy to do that kind of testing and see what works. And that, I think, is much more what's going on now.
Mm-hmm. That's some fertile ground for some research. If with everybody now walking to a restaurant and scanning a barcode for their menu, you can really have some fun with that by dynamically presenting it. But I think few of the pieces of advice I've seen are based on behavioral research, the anchoring effect of putting a very expensive item or the most expensive bottle of wine at the top of the list to anchor that high price to make the rest of the menu look cheap. I don't know if to what extent people have experimented on how that changed the average order value, but based on, Ariely's work and some other work, I think that probably would help. But it'd be interesting to actually run the study. Now, as you point out, particularly now that you can randomize menus, which in the past would have been next to impossible.
But let's think about that for a second, because I think one thing that I start thinking about is what you see for paper menus could be very different for an oral menu. So in talking about the effective order, it turns out being first is usually the best. But imagine instead of having you the entrees written in front of you, the waiter is speaking them like they do in some fancy restaurants. Now, the first one you might remember, but you're just as likely to remember the last one, right? Because the ones in between are wiping out that first one. Right? Again, the importance of memory. So it turns out, I think advice like saying always do X is going to sometimes lead you astray. You need to understand what the processes that are going on to help you really do a good job in doing that kind of choice architecture.
Yeah, personally, those spoken menus annoy the heck out of me. I mean, I'm fine with one special or 2 specials that I can process, right. But whenever it gets too long, it's like, wasn't there a seafood dish in the middle there? What was that again? What kind of sauce was that?
Right.
It just very effortful.
Give me a pad and paper, right?
Definitely. I have to take notes on this.
Right.
One company that has been wildly successful is Amazon, and they present infinite choice. I mean, basically, you can buy anything there. If you search for any particular product, they carry almost any variation of that product, often multiples of the same thing. It's just endless, but they're very successful. How do they adjust their choice architecture to prevent this sort of paradox of choice effect where people just say, this is way too confusing, I'm going someplace else?
So 2 points. First one, which is minor, which is, how many options you present somebody isn't as simple as keep it to 2 or 3. That's a place where you need to understand the difference between the cost of making up your mind, which increases with the number of options, but also the fact there's a little bit of you're discovering other options. And if I don't know what you want, I can't say we have vanilla cake and then stop. If I don't know what you want, I have to present you more options. So there's that tension that goes on. But Amazon's been very good at trying to draw attention. So you'll often see Amazon's choice ranked number 1. And what that does is that makes you consider that option first. And as we've said, that will give you, in most cases, an advantage. So Amazon subtly, focuses attention on one option, the other. Notice Amazon's choice is not exactly in a gray color. It's usually bright orange, and it's one of the first things you see on the website. So I think that's one of the things you can do. They also give you tools like being able to sort. So you can sort by rating or sort by price or decide to eliminate things that aren't Amazon Prime. So they really have built what I call a choice engine, a tool for actually helping you make choices. It's not to say I don't still feel overwhelmed when I see the 60th version of the same thing, as you point out, but at least they're doing something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one area of choice that I think is probably most of our audience members have experienced is a kind of manipulative choice experience, what some people call dark pattern choices, where the choice, the company, usually this is done by businesses who have some kind of a vested interest in your choice. So it's really easy to subscribe, but very, very difficult to unsubscribe. And, how, I guess we can agree that it's evil, but how do you prevent this? Do you see any movement to try and build any sort of ethical guidelines that businesses would actually pay attention to? Now, not all businesses do this, but I think of businesses like cable companies and satellite companies where they've got a kind of a monopoly, and boy, it's brutal.
And it's really important because it's not obvious, at least to me, that you could easily write a regulation that says all things should be in a certain font. A good example of this, you always have to have an opt-out on a mailing list. Now, I've seen emails where I've seen an opt-out, but it's in very dark gray on a black background. It's there, but someone who's very clever has figured out how to essentially make that disappear. One of the places I think this is really very powerful is in privacy policies and in cookies. And you'll see every time you go to a website these days, something that says essentially, if you continue to use the site, you will have agreed to our cookie policy. And there's usually a big red X on the right-hand corner, so you can make that go away. That's a good example of we know something. If I simply change that to make it yes, no, of equal color, so they're both red, you get about a 29% increase in people saying no. So that's a place where choice architecture makes a difference. I'm not saying cookies are good or bad. I'm just saying your choices there are very susceptible to the way the designer presents them.
Well, you had an amusing example of a study that this was not an actual business doing this, but where people accepted terms and conditions that included things like, we're going to give your data to the NSA and you have to give us your firstborn child, or crazy stuff like that.
Study.
And 98% of the people clicked OK.
Yes.
Which, it tells you something about how most of us read. What are you going to do? Are you really going to page through 30 pages of fine print that's almost incomprehensible language when all you want to do is use the website, get the software or whatever they apply to? You've got to click yes.
And think about it in terms of this notion of plausible path and ease. I want to download the software. I want to book the flight. I want to make the dinner reservation. And then you're asking me about cookies, which is something that's hard to understand. And the consequences aren't going to be right now. I'm going to get the reservation right now. But whatever happens if I say yes to cookies is going to happen in what seems like the long term. So again, you overweight immediate short-term costs in making those decisions. Then you take the plausible path of let's make that go away and let's get on with my business at hand.
Right. Well, I guess if all of us keep drawing attention to these areas, maybe some practices will change, whether it's because of legal constraints or simply people calling out these bad practices. I've encouraged our audience members always, when they encounter things that are unnecessarily difficult or effortful, or even constitute a dark pattern of some kind to call out the brands on social media. I think that's one thing that can influence behavior. When it gets called out often enough, then maybe the practices will stop. I've seen certainly in the same industries, I think the wireless phone industry is one where they've had all these terms and conditions made it difficult to sign up, hidden charges, rates would go up after time, and so on. And then a competitor would come in and say, no, we've got a simple plan. Sign up when you want, cancel when you want. There's, very simple choice button here. It costs X bucks a month, and that's it. That's all. And as those companies start to gain market share, the other companies, in many cases, end up adjusting their practices because those practices aren't competitive anymore.
Right. The Magenta company to which we refer made that simple plan, a very important selling point for them. But let me be a little bit of a pessimist, even though I'm an optimist most of the time, that if you look at things like defaults or lots of other things, but defaults we know the most about, people don't realize that they have an effect. You give people a choice with a default, and because you've compared them to other people, they're choosing default more often. You say, does that default affect you? And they end up saying, no, other people it's going to affect, but not me. And so, if you don't realize it's having an influence, it's very hard to call it out. And that is a real challenge.
Right. Well, I hate to end on a pessimistic note, but I think overall we can say we have quite a bit of optimism here. Eric, how can people find you and your ideas?
So the best place right now is, of course, in the book, which goes on sale October 12th. And there's a website called elementsofchoice.com. And be happy to email me at eric.johnson@columbia.edu. Great.
Well, we will link to those places on the show notes page at rogerdooley.com/podcast and any other resources we mentioned today. Eric, thanks so much for being on the show. I really enjoyed the book.
Roger, thank you so much. And thank you for all your listeners. I hope they've learned something.